It's 1980. It's time to celebrate one of the greatest years in the history of hard rock and heavy metal. We've got quality. Some of the greatest albums in the history of hard rock and heavy metal are going to happen right now. And quantity. Because not only do we have all these great bands that have been existing from the first and second wave of heavy metal and hard rock, we are now entering the third age of heavy metal. Raise your leather fists high in the air. It's time to celebrate. The new wave of British heavy metal has arrived on the scene. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to year 2 of the Metal Dude Abides, and what an appropriate way to kick off the year. Celebrating the new wave of British heavy metal, celebrating the year 1980, one of my all-time favorite years in the history of music, new backdrop, and appropriately one of the biggest bands in the new wave of British heavy metal over my shoulder, Iron Maiden. Oh, what a time to be alive. Listen, we have gone through what was considered the drought. Listen, in the early 70s, you had the British big three. You had Led Zeppelin, you had Black Sabbath, you had Deep Purple. But here's the problem with those bands, and those bands are legendary, but both Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath in particular were sputtering towards the end of the decade. And Deep Purple had completely broke up altogether. And so the fact that Sabbath wasn't really as good as they were when they started, the fact that Zeppelin wasn't as good as when they started, and Deep Purple was gone, people had moved away from hard rock and heavy metal. We were being mocked. It was called dinosaur rock, and all the record industries were looking for something new. They were looking at disco. They were looking at punk. They were looking at skinny tie bands, and metal was thought to be dead. But in the mid-70s, we had that second wave of heavy metal music. Judas Priest, AC/DC, the Scorpions, Rainbow. These were bands that were so good that despite the fact that the market wasn't there in the late 70s, their momentum could no longer be ignored. And those bands who stood in there and raised the flag for heavy metal ushered in a new era of heavy metal that's now being capped off by the new wave of British heavy metal. And we're going to talk about that. So you have all these great bands that kept the music alive, being joined by new forces that pump new power and new enthusiasm into music like never before. 1980 is so big because think about this. We go from being out of the mainstream to, for the next decade and a half, heavy metal music is going to be played in arenas and stadiums all over the world. And we're going to have such an impact on music. It's all going to start right here. So it's easy to see why I get excited about talking about 1980. Now, if you've been watching the channel, we go through year by year and we talk about how the Grammys should have awarded heavy metal, and we go through different categories. But 1980 is such a monumental year. We're going to split it up a little bit. So tonight, we're just going to talk about the newcomers of the year. And you can't talk about newcomers without talking about the new wave of British heavy metal, the NWOBHM bands. So we're going to start there, and we're going to nominate 5 newcomers for the ultimate prize of Newcomer of the Year in 1980. Now, believe it or not, there's even more bands than just those big 5. So let's start off with a little bit of a honorable mention. 1980 Best New Metal Act. Honorable mention. Angel Witch, who puts out a self-titled album in 1980 that is one of the best albums in the entirety of the NWOBHM movement. But it doesn't get a lot of credit because, unfortunately, Angel Witch kind of blew up on launch. They didn't really get off the launch pad. Why? Because the band was literally breaking up as they were breaking big. So there was really nothing to hold on to, nothing to really celebrate here. As soon as the band came out, there was always squabbling, and band members were going off to different bands, and well, the whole thing fell apart pretty quick. But luckily for us, they put out one sensational album, Angel Witch, that if you haven't heard, go back, take a listen to. I think you will be very impressed. The thing about 1980, we talked about the 70s, how great the music was, but how dated the sound was. And it's like a bolt of lightning. In 1980, all of a sudden, in my humble opinion, a lot of the production issues that I don't care for in the 70s seem to be rectified, and off we go to the races. Angel Witch, we're going to talk about this a lot with a lot of these bands, has such a great sound. Really great guitar tone on this album. The vocals are kind of distant. They kind of really do a cool thing with the vocals, really kind of make the band sound a lot more haunting for the music. Love this band. Our first honorable mention, Angel Witch. Our second honorable mention is a little bit of a cheat code, but it's my channel. I get to cheat if I want to, because technically this band isn't eligible for the Newcomer of the Year because they did put out an album in 1979. But because we're talking about the new wave of British heavy metal, and this band is one of the biggest bands of that movement, and because they had such an impact on 1980, I wanted to talk about the band Saxon. Biff Byford and the boys really come out strong in 1980. They're kind of ahead of everybody else, really. They put out not one, but two sensational albums, Wheels of Steel and Strong Arm of the Law. And not only are they going to put out those two albums, but they're going to go on a run where they also put out Denim and Leather. They're also going to put out Power and the Glory. They're on a absolute tear right now, putting out some of the best music in the heavy metal world. Now, Saxon's history is a little bit, has its ups and downs. They also go through bad breakups and court lawsuits over the name Saxon. And after this little 4 or 5 album run here, they kind of start to drift off towards a commercial direction that I didn't really care for. So I kind of move away from Saxon for a number of years. But in the year 1997, they put out an album called Unleash the Beast. And folks, it's kind of where they kick back off kind of a second wind to their career that's still going to this day. They put out an album in 2024, Hell, Fire, and Damnation. I did a review of it at the beginning of this year. Oh boy, it's one of the best metal albums of the year. Think about this. They're tearing it up in 1980, and they're tearing it up in 2024. Whew. Having a career that spans 45 years across 5 decades. What a great band. We celebrate Saxon today as our second nominee. Another huge band that comes out of the NWOBHM movement and has a sensational debut, the Tigers of Pantang, with their debut album, Wildcat. I love the Tigers of Pantang. They are one of my favorite bands that comes out of this movement. Their first album's very good. It only goes up from here. Next year, John Sykes, one of my favorite guitarists, joins the band. They put out 2 great albums, Spellbound and Crazy Nights. And once again, very similar to Saxon, in the year 2023, the Tigers of Pantang put out a great album. And I believe they just put out a live album in 2024. Folks, Tigers of Pantang are one of those bands that just have such a great guitar sound to their music. They come charging out of the gates. It just goes to show you, Tigers of Pantang, Angel Witch, 2 bands, brand new bands, who can't even get a nomination for Best Newcomer of the Year because there's so much competition this year. So many great bands coming out. Both of these get honorable mention, but boy, they had such an impact on music. They had to be talked about today. But talking about nominations, let's talk about the bands that are actually nominated for Best New Artist. Our first nominee, Newcomer of the Year, Def Leppard. You knew they had to be on this list. Def Leppard was a little bit the apple of my eye in 1980. I really fell in love with Def Leppard. Their first two albums, On Through the Night and High and Dry, are two of my favorite albums of all time. Repeat it, repeat, repeat. The production on these two albums, the guitar tone on these albums. Pete Willis was on both of these albums. I just have to give him credit because after these two albums, well, let's just say my relationship in Def Leppard start to wane a bit. And Pete Willis is gone. You start putting two together and realize Pete Willis was the magic of Def Leppard. But they come out smoking. Now back to my personal trials and tribulations with Def Leppard. After those first two albums, they come out with the album Pyromania. And I was never so disappointed in an album in all my days. Like, this is the trouble we had in the 80s was we love our heavy metal. We like our heavy metal hard and gritty. But the record companies were looking, and the bands themselves were looking for fame and fortune and kind of breaking out of the metal world and becoming more mainstream. I remember telling all my friends, Def Leppard's going to be the biggest band in the world. They're going to be the next AC/DC. And they were. They were huge. But not in the way I wanted them to be. They kind of sold out, really went with a much more commercial sound on Pyromania, blew up all over MTV, and I just didn't like their music ever again. But these first two albums, despite my later year trials and tribulations with them, you can't deny these first two. They are absolutely tremendous, and really were really the flag bearers for this movement. So our first nominee, Def Leppard. For every action, there's a reaction. For every yin, there's a yang. We just got through talking about Def Leppard, one of the most commercially successful bands of all time. Our second nominee, Diamond Head. A band that just never really took off, never really made it. Let's face it, if you are familiar with Diamond Head, you're probably familiar because Metallica covered some of their better songs. Let's face it, Metallica had better success with Diamond Head's material than Diamond Head did. And it's one of those strange things where you look at the band and you go, I don't understand what else they could have done. This was tremendous stuff. But I'll try to weed through it. One of the things that happens is they come out in 1980 with an album, Lightning to the Nations. And it has on there the all-time great, Am I Evil? But it has some other good songs on here. Notably, The Prince is also on this album. But for whatever reason, it just doesn't work. And again, maybe it didn't even get released in the States. I'm not entirely sure about this. Because then in 1982, they kind of repackaged themselves. And they put out the album Borrowed Time. Now, you'll notice when I put the logo for Diamond Head, I used the album cover from Borrowed Time because it is one of my favorite album covers of all time. I remember seeing this album and just freaking out like, this is gonna be good. And it is. Now, the funny thing is they take Am I Evil off Lightning to the Nations and stick it on Borrowed Time. But the rest of the album's much more melodic, not as heavy as Lightning to the Nations. And so it just never made it. And it's a shame because I think this is a very talented band. And in a very short time, put out two of the greatest songs of all time. They caught Metallica's, ear for sure. And again, Metallica ran with it and put Am I Evil on their very first album, Kill 'Em All, and just knocked it out of the park. But don't sleep on Diamond Head. If you've never heard the original, if you've never given Diamond Head a chance, go back in time and listen to Lightning to the Nations. I think it is the heavier and better album. And again, we can all scratch our heads and wonder where it all went wrong. Our second nominee for Newcomer of the Year, Diamond Head. I wonder who our third nominee could be. I wonder if it's a Stand Over My Shoulder. Up the Irons. Iron Maiden has come on the scene, and they're our third nominee for Newcomer of the Year. Folks, Iron Maiden was the major force behind the new wave of British heavy metal. Def Leppard's in the big three, Saxon's in the big three, but Iron Maiden was the impetus for a lot of this. There's some great stories about how, again, especially in England, punk was ruling the day, but Iron Maiden put out some demos, and they started getting played in clubs, and people started showing up to listen to the Iron Maiden. And there was like bars in England where people were showing up in their leather jackets doing air guitar to Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden, you knew they were going to be big right off the bat. Tremendous band. Now this original, and again, they put out a self-titled album, Iron Maiden. This is the original stuff, folks. This is back in the Paul Di'Anno era. Of course, we know in a couple of years they're going to completely switch things up. They're going to go with Bruce Dickinson. It's kind of funny. If you think about Iron Maiden being a really stable band all these decades, there's really only the two original members, Steve Harris on bass and Dave Murray on guitar. Everybody else, they kind of were mixing and matching. And that's one of the things about the new wave of British heavy metal. It's kind of funny to watch these bands, and a lot of these bands coming and going, because they were kind of interchanging pieces, and hey, you guys got a great guitarist over there, or hey, your vocalist we really like. Bruce Dickinson, of course, coming from Samson, another really good band in the new wave of British heavy metal, putting out albums this year. Iron Maiden says, we'll take him, thank you. And so there was a lot of switching and swapping of players, and so there was just so many bands and so many musicians around, you really saw a lot of movement. But what can you say about Iron Maiden? You could go on for hours and talk about the history of Iron Maiden, one of the greatest bands in the history of heavy metal, still going strong in the year 2024. This first iteration with Paul Di'Anno is going to last 2 albums, and they're going to put out some real bangers. So our third nominee, Iron Maiden. Now, about now, you're probably thinking to yourself, Metal Dude, you said there's going to be 5 nominees for Best Newcomer, and you've just gone through all the bands from the new wave of British heavy metal. We've only got 3 nominees. Something's not adding up. Well, there are 2 bands that are going to get nominated for Newcomer of the Year that aren't part of the new wave of British heavy metal, and kind of fall into a weird category for me, because these are bands that kind of were formed by legendary performers of the 70s, but are started embarking on solo careers in 1980. The first of those is one of my favorite guitarists of all time, Michael Schenker. He has a debut album, again, many of these self-titled, the Michael Schenker Group, MSG. We're going to talk a lot more about Michael Schenker next week, because we're going to talk about Best Musical Performance. But let me just say, Michael Schenker starts off with the Scorpions, very famous. Him and his brother were part of the Scorpions. Rudolf Schenker is still with the Scorpions today. And then he gets snagged by the band UFO, who sees what a talented performer Michael Schenker is. He joins UFO, and through the vast part of the decade of the 70s, UFO is putting out hit album after hit album, hit song after hit song, and his guitar is the impetus for all that. But he leaves UFO and goes back to the Scorpions, but only is back for like 4 or 5 songs on the Love Drive album, before Michael Schenker finally makes the decision, enough is enough, I'm going to go form my own band. And here, he has his debut album in 1980, the Michael Schenker Group, our number 4 nominee for Best Newcomer of the Year. Our 5th and final nominee for Best Newcomer of the Year, Ozzy Osbourne and the Blizzard of Oz. Man, oh man, we're going to talk a lot about this album next week, because it's going to be prominent in Best Music Award, because here Ozzy Osbourne comes out with a new band and a new guitarist by Randy Rhoads that I can talk a lot about. We'll talk about him more next week. But this album is an absolute barn burner, one of the greatest albums in the history of heavy metal. and Ozzy's about to embark on a very successful solo career. Our fifth and final nominee, Ozzy Osbourne, Blizzard of Oz. Now I'm going to do something I rarely do. I'm going to have two winners, and I'm going to make up my own category because it's my show and I get to do whatever I want. So the first award is going to go to Ozzy Osbourne and the Blizzard of Oz. But instead of granting them Newcomer of the Year, I'm going to give them Comeback of the Year. Because let's face it, Ozzy Osbourne, well, let's just say that his career had not been going well in Black Sabbath. He had, their music had been terrible the last couple of years. The booze was flowing, the drugs were flowing, marriages were ending. It was a train wreck. And not to be over dramatic, but this is one of those times where you think to yourself, we're going to just read an article one day that's going to say Ozzy Osbourne, former lead singer of Black Sabbath, found dead from an overdose. It looked grim for Ozzy. And for him to come back the way he did, stronger than ever. Ozzy's solo career is every bit as impressive as the things he was doing with Black Sabbath. And he really turned it around. Now, we're going to be talking a lot more about this album if you want to hear more content about Ozzy Osbourne. Because this album is going to be featured prominently next week when we talk about best musical performances because, well, two words, Randy Rhoads. We're going to talk a lot about Randy Rhoads next week. Really gave Ozzy that fresh feel. What a find for Ozzy. Bringing Randy along into the spotlight was a master stroke. Our second award is going to be more traditionally based on Best Newcomer of the Year. You know, a band that's brand new to the scene, the freshest face. And that award goes to Iron Maiden. Now, if we're being completely honest here, the 1980 version of me might have given the award to Def Leppard. On Through the Night and High and Dry, that era of Def Leppard, they were definitely the apple of my eye. I was really into Def Leppard at that point. But this isn't the 1980 version of me handing out this award. This is today's version of me going back to 1980. And I've seen the future, and the future is Iron Maiden. Because after Def Leppard gets off to such a great start with 2 albums, they're going to go off in a commercial direction. Iron Maiden, on the other hand, is going to remain a stalwart for the heavy metal movement for 40 plus years. They are the clear choice. Now, the Grammys that year, they selected Christopher Cross, who has a mega album that year. I'm not going to deny it. Everybody remembers Christopher Cross and Ride Like the Wind. Huge hit. Like, it was on radio 24/7. But, and I've mentioned this before, when we talk about Grammy selections, the Grammys are supposed to be the people who know the most about music. And yet, they fall for that one hit wonder, that one album wonder over and over and over again, instead of really looking at the talent of a band and the staying power of a band. Christopher Cross never had another hit. He was a one album wonder. And a few years later, his career was over. Oh, he put out a few albums here and there. He's probably working the Vegas Strip right now. But he didn't have that lasting impact that a band like Iron Maiden had. That even a band like Def Leppard had. The Grammys completely missed not just the talented bands, but the bands that were going to make a long-lasting impact. So I can't give the Newcomer of the Year to Christopher Cross. But I do have to recognize something, that while Iron Maiden has been a stalwart for the heavy metal movement for 40 plus years, I can't give them the award either. So I'm going to go back to the Comeback Award. And I'm going to give Newcomer of the Year across the board to Ozzy Osbourne. Because Ozzy has had the biggest impact in music outside metal and outside of metal of probably anybody in the movement. He was, a big, trailblazer 50 years ago, but has been one of those people. Just look at the last few years, the number of influences that Ozzy's brought into the tent. Post Malone, etc. Ozzy has been that big of an impact, not just in heavy metal and hard rock, but in the music industry in whole. So congratulations to Ozzy Osbourne, who's going to win Best Newcomer of the Year across the board. Congratulations to Iron Maiden for bringing home Best Newcomer for the heavy metal and hard rock category. And that's our show. And this is the time of this episode where I say it's time to turn over a new leaf. It's a brand new year here on The Metal Dude Abides. So subscribe to the channel. Give it a thumbs up. Get notified of new content. We're going to be doing a slew of videos about the year 1980. We're going to be talking about next week best musical performances. We're going to go in depth talking about Michael Schenker, Randy Rhoads, and others. A couple of weeks from now, we're going to be talking about the best vocalists of 1980. Boy, there's some great singers in metal right now. Then we're going to do a special on the best hard rock album song. And then the granddaddy of them all, we're going to do the best heavy metal song and the best heavy metal album to wrap up the year 1980. And you don't want to miss any of that. So subscribe, get in there, ring the bell, get notified. We're going to try to do this every Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. But in the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.